The events of any given period of history are the result of the thinking of the preceding period. The 19th century, with its political freedom, science, industry, business, trade, all the necessary conditions of material progress, was the result and the last achievement of the intellectual power released by the Renaissance. The men engaged in those activities were still riding on the remnants of an Aristotelian influence in philosophy, particularly on an Aristotelian epistemology, more implicitly than explicitly, but they were like men living on the energy of the light rays of a distant star, who did not know, it was not their primary task to know, that that star had been extinguished. It had been extinguished by those whose primary task was to sustain it. From the start of the post-Renaissance period, philosophy, released from its bondage as handmaiden of theology, went seeking a new form of servitude, like a frightened slave broken in spirit who recoils from the responsibility of freedom. Descartes set the direction of the retreat by bringing the witch-doctor back into philosophy. While promising a philosophical system as rational, demonstrable, and scientific as mathematics, Descartes began with the basic epistemological premise of every witch-doctor, a premise he shared explicitly with Augustine. The prior certainty of consciousness, the belief that the existence of an external world is not self-evident, but must be proved by deduction from the contents of one's consciousness, which means the concept of consciousness as some faculty other than the faculty of perception, which means the indiscriminate contents of one's consciousness as the irreducible, primary, and absolute to which reality has to conform. What followed was the grotesquely tragic spectacle of philosophers struggling to prove the existence of an external world by staring with the witch-doctor's blind inward stare at the random twists of their conceptions, then of perceptions, then of sensations. When the medieval witch-doctor had merely ordered men to doubt the validity of their mind, the philosopher's rebellion against him consisted of proclaiming that they doubted whether man was conscious at all, and whether anything existed for him to be conscious of. It is at this point that Attila entered the philosophical scene. Attila, the type of man who longs to live on the perceptual level of consciousness, without the interference of any concepts, to act on the whim and range of the moment without the hampering restriction of principles or theories, without the necessity of integrating one experience with another or one moment with the next, saw his chance to escape from his subservience to the witch-doctor, which he had always resented, to muscle in on the racket, one would have to say, and to obtain from science the sanction of his actions and of his psychoepistemology. Attila, who hated and feared intellectual issues, saw his chance to take over the intellect, and found his voice. When Hume declared that he saw objects moving about, but never saw such a thing as causality, it was the voice of Attila that men were hearing. It was Attila's soul that spoke when Hume declared that he experienced a flow of fleeting states inside his skull, such as sensations, feelings, or memories, but had never caught the experience of such a thing as consciousness or self. When Hume declared that the apparent existence of an object did not guarantee that it would not vanish spontaneously next moment, and the sunrise of today did not prove that the sun would rise tomorrow. When he declared that philosophical speculation was a game, like chess or hunting, of no significance whatever to the practical course of human existence, since reason proved that existence was unintelligible, and only the ignorant maintained the illusion of knowledge. All of this accompanied by vehement opposition to the mysticism of the witch-doctor, and by protestations of loyalty to reason and science. What men were hearing was the manifesto of a philosophical movement that can be designated only as Attilaism. If it were possible for an animal to describe the content of his consciousness, the result would be a transcript of Hume's philosophy. Hume's conclusions would be the conclusions of a consciousness limited to the perceptual level of awareness. passively reacting to the experience of immediate concretes, with no capacity to form abstractions, to integrate perceptions into concepts, waiting in vain for the appearance of an object labeled causality, except that such a consciousness would not be able to draw conclusions. To negate man's mind, it is the conceptual level of his consciousness that has to be invalidated. Under all the tortuous complexities, contradictions, equivocations, rationalizations of the post-Renaissance philosophy, the one consistent line, the fundamental that explains the rest, is a concerted attack on man's conceptual faculty. Most philosophers did not intend to invalidate conceptual knowledge, but its defenders did more to destroy it than did its enemies. They were unable to offer a solution to the problem of universals, that is, to define the nature and source of abstractions, to determine the relationship of concepts to perceptual data, and to prove the validity of scientific induction. Ignoring the lead of Aristotle, who had not left them a full answer to the problem, but had shown the direction and the method by which the answer could be found, the philosophers were unable to refute the witch-doctor's claim that their concepts were as arbitrary as his whims, and that their scientific knowledge had no greater metaphysical validity than his revelations. The philosophers chose to solve the problem by conceding the witch-doctor's claim, and by surrendering to him the conceptual level of man's consciousness, a victory no witch-doctor could have hoped to achieve on his own. The form of that absurd concession was the philosophers' ultimate division into two camps: those who claimed that man obtains his knowledge of the world by deducing it exclusively from concepts, which come from inside his head and are not derived from the perception of physical facts, the rationalists, and those who claimed that man obtains his knowledge from experience, which was held to mean by direct perception of immediate facts with no recourse to concepts, the empiricists. To put it more simply, those who joined the witch-doctor by abandoning reality, and those who clung to reality by abandoning their mind. Thus reason was pushed off the philosophical scene by default, by implication, by evasion. What had started as a serious problem between two camps of serious thinkers soon degenerated to the level where nothing was left on the field of philosophy but a battle between witch-doctors and Attila-ists. The man who formalized this state and closed the door of philosophy to reason was Immanuel Kant. Kant gave metaphysical expression to the psycho-epistemology of Attila and the witch-doctor, and to their primordial existential relationship, shutting out of his universe the existence and the psycho-epistemology of the producer. He surrendered philosophy to Attila, and ensured its future delivery back into the power of the witch-doctor. He turned the world over to Attila, but reserved to the witch-doctor the realm of morality. Kant's expressly stated purpose was to save the morality of self-abnegation and self-sacrifice. He knew that it could not survive without a mystic base, and what it had to be saved from was reason. Attila's share of Kant's universe includes this earth, physical reality, man's senses, perceptions, reason, and science, all of it labeled the phenomenal world. The witch-doctor's share is another, higher reality labeled the noumenal world, and a special manifestation labeled the categorical imperative, which dictates to man the rules of morality and which makes itself known by means of a feeling, as a special sense of duty. The phenomenal world, said Kant, is not real. Reality, as perceived by man's mind, is a distortion. The distorting mechanism is man's conceptual faculty. Man's basic concepts, such as time, space, existence, are not derived from experience or reality, but come from an automatic system of filters in his consciousness, labeled categories and forms of perception, which impose their own design on his perception of the external world and make him incapable of perceiving it in any manner other than the one in which he does perceive it. This proves, said Kant, that man's concepts are only a delusion, but a collective delusion, which no one has the power to escape. Thus reason and science are limited, said Kant. They are valid only so long as they deal with this world, with a permanent, predetermined collective delusion. And thus the criterion of reason's validity was switched from the objective to the collective. But they are impotent to deal with the fundamental metaphysical issues of existence, which belong to the noumenal world. The noumenal world is unknowable. It is the world of real reality, superior truth, and things in themselves, or things as they are, which means things as they are not perceived by man. Even apart from the fact that Kant's theory of the categories as the source of man's concepts was a preposterous invention, his argument amounted to a negation, not only of man's consciousness, but of any consciousness, of consciousness as such. His argument, in essence, ran as follows. Man is limited to a consciousness of a specific nature, which perceives by specific means and no others. Therefore, his consciousness is not valid. Man is blind because he has eyes, deaf because he has ears, deluded because he has a mind, and the things he perceives do not exist because he perceives them. As to Kant's version of morality, it was appropriate to the kind of zombies that would inhabit that kind of universe. It consisted of total, abject selflessness. An action is moral, said Kant, only if one has no desire to perform it, but performs it out of a sense of duty, and derives no benefit from it of any sort, neither material nor spiritual. A benefit destroys the moral value of an action. Thus, if one has no desire to be evil, one cannot be good. If one has, one can. Those who accept any part of Kant's philosophy, metaphysical, epistemological, or moral, deserve it. If one finds the present state of the world unintelligible and inexplicable, one can begin to understand it by realizing that the dominant intellectual influence today is still Kant's, and that all the leading modern schools of philosophy are derived from a Kantian base. The popular slang expression head shrinker, applied to psychologists, is much more literally applicable to Kant. Observe the sharp drop in the intellectual stature of the post-Kantian philosophers, and the progressively thickening veil of grayness, superficiality, casuistry that descends on the history of philosophy thereafter, like a fog enveloping a sluggish river that runs thinner and thinner and finally vanishes in the swamps of the 20th century. The major line of philosophers rejected Kant's noumenal world quite speedily, but they accepted his phenomenal world and carried it to its logical consequences. The view of reality as mere appearance, the view of man's conceptual faculty as a mechanism for producing arbitrary constructs not derived from experience or facts, the view of rational certainty as impossible, of science as unprovable, of man's mind as impotent, and above all, the equation of morality with selflessness. They rejected the root or cause of Kant's system, but accepted all of its deadly effects. They accepted it as some monstrous spider hanging in mid-air, in a web of unintelligible, almost unreadable verbiage. And today, few people know that that spider is not supported by a single thread of proof. Such was the intellectual equipment with which philosophers approached the task of observing the unprecedented historical events of the 19th century, and the responsibility of providing guidance for the new free society of capitalism. While scientists were performing astounding feats of disciplined reason, breaking down the barriers of the unknowable in every field of knowledge, charting the course of light rays in space, or the course of blood in the capillaries of man's body, what philosophy was offering them, as interpretation of and guidance for their achievements, was the plain witch-doctory of Hegel, who proclaimed that matter does not exist at all, that everything is idea, not somebody's idea, just idea, and that this idea operates by the dialectical process of a new super-logic, is to be derived not from the observation of facts, but from the contemplation of that idea's triple somersaults inside his, Hegel's, mind. This was offered as a philosophy of reason. While businessmen were rising to spectacular achievements of creative ability and self-confidently ambitious courage, challenging the primordial dogma of man's poverty and misery on earth, breaking open the trade routes of the world, releasing mankind's productive energy and placing in its service the liberating power of machines, against the scornful resistance of loafing ex-feudal aristocrats and the destructive violence of those who were to profit most, the workers. What philosophy was offering as an evaluation of their achievements and as guidance for the rest of society was the pure Attilaism of Marx, who proclaimed that the mind does not exist, that everything is matter, that matter develops itself by the dialectical process of its own super-logic of contradictions, and what is true today will not be true tomorrow, that the material tools of production determine men's ideological superstructure, which means machines create men's thinking, not the other way around, that muscular labor is the source of wealth, that physical force is the only practical means of existence, and that the seizure of the omnipotent machines will transfer omnipotence to the rule of brute violence. Never had Attila's psychoepistemology been transcribed so accurately. This was offered as a philosophy of history and of political economy. What was offered as philosophical antidote to those who would not accept these theories? As a defense against the witch-doctrine of Kant and Hegel, the businessman was offered the neo-mystic Attilaism of the pragmatists. They declared that philosophy must be practical, and that practicality consists of dispensing with all absolute principles and standards, that there is no such thing as objective reality or permanent truth, that truth is that which works, and its validity can be judged only by its consequences, that no facts can be known with certainty in advance, and anything may be tried by rule of thumb, that reality is not firm but fluid and indeterminate, that there is no such thing as a distinction between an external world and a consciousness, between the perceived and the perceiver. There is only an undifferentiated package deal labeled experience, and whatever one wishes to be true is true. Whatever one wishes to exist does exist, provided it works or makes one feel better. A later school of more Kantian pragmatists amended this philosophy as follows. If there is no such thing as an objective reality, men's metaphysical choice is whether the selfish, dictatorial whims of an individual or the democratic whims of a collective are to shape that plastic goo which the ignorant call reality. Therefore, this school decided that objectivity consists of collective subjectivism, that knowledge is to be gained by means of public polls among special elites of competent investigators who can predict and control reality, that whatever people wish to be true is true, whatever people wish to exist does exist, and anyone who holds any firm convictions of his own is an arbitrary mystic dogmatist, since reality is indeterminate and people determine its actual nature. The scientist was offered a slightly different version of philosophy. As a defense against the witch doctrine of Hegel, who claimed universal omniscience, the scientist was offered the combined neo-mystic witch doctrine and Attilaism of the logical positivists. They assured him that such concepts as metaphysics or existence or reality or thing or matter or mind are meaningless. Let the mystics care whether they exist or not. A scientist does not have to know it. The task of theoretical science is the manipulation of symbols, and scientists are the special elite whose symbols have the magic power of making reality conform to their will. Matter is that which fits mathematical equations. Knowledge, they said, consists not of facts, but of words. Words unrelated to objects, words of an arbitrary social convention, as an irreducible primary. Thus knowledge is merely a matter of manipulating language. The job of scientists, they said, is not the study of reality, but the creation of arbitrary constructs by means of arbitrary sounds, and any construct is as valid as another, since the criterion of validity is only convenience, and the definition of science is that which the scientists do. But this omnipotent power, surpassing the dreams of ancient numerologists or of medieval alchemists, was granted to the scientist by philosophical Attilaism on two conditions. A, that he never claims certainty for his knowledge, since certainty is unknowable to man, and that he claim instead percentages of probability, not troubling himself with such questions as how one calculates percentages of the unknowable. B, that he claim as absolute knowledge the proposition that all values lie outside the sphere of science, that reason is impotent to deal with morality, that moral values are a matter of subjective choice, dictated by one's feelings, not one's mind. The great treason of the philosophers was that they never stepped out of the Middle Ages. They never challenged the witch doctor's code of morality. They were willing to doubt the existence of physical objects. They were willing to doubt the validity of their own senses. They were willing to defy the authority of absolute monarchies. They were willing, occasionally, to proclaim themselves to be skeptics or agnostics or atheists, but they were not willing to doubt the doctrine that man is a sacrificial animal, that he has no right to exist for his own sake, that service to others is the only justification of his existence, and that self-sacrifice is his highest moral duty, virtue, and value. Under all its countless guises, variations, and adaptations, that doctrine, best designated as the morality of altruism, has come from prehistoric swamps to New York City, unchanged. In savage societies, men practiced the ritual of human sacrifices, immolating individual men on sacrificial altars for the sake of what they regarded as their collective tribal good. Today they are still doing it. Only the agony is slower and the slaughter greater. But the doctrine that demands it and sanctions it is the same doctrine of moral cannibalism. The philosophers preserved it by leaving the subject of morality to the mystics, or by consigning it to the province of subjective feelings, which means to the mystics, or by the vehement rejection of reason's capacity to deal with moral values, and the branding of all value judgments as unscientific, which means the reaffirmation and perpetuation of the mystics' monopoly on morality. Or worst of all, by accepting the mystic's moral code in its irrational entirety, then translating it into earthly terms and propagating it in the name of reason. The convolutions of this last attempt provide what is perhaps the most grotesquely terrible chapter in the history of Western thought. The political Me Tooism, abjectly displayed by the conservatives of today toward their brazenly socialistic adversaries, is only the result and the feeble reflection of the ethical Me Tooism displayed by the philosophers of the 19th and 20th centuries, by the alleged champions of reason toward the witch doctors of morality. Auguste Comte, the founder of positivism, the champion of science, advocated a rational, scientific social system based on the total subjugation of the individual to the collective, including a religion of humanity which substituted society for the gods, or gods who collect the blood of sacrificial victims. It is not astonishing that Comte was the coiner of the term altruism, which means the placing of others above self, of their interests above one's own. Nietzsche's rebellion against altruism consisted of replacing the sacrifice of oneself to others by the sacrifice of others to oneself. He proclaimed that the ideal man is moved not by reason but by his blood, by his innate instincts, feelings, and will to power, that he is predestined by birth to rule others and sacrifice them to himself, while they are predestined by birth to be his victims and slaves, that reason, logic, principles are futile and debilitating, that morality is useless, that the Superman is beyond good and evil, that he is a beast of prey whose ultimate standard is nothing but his own whim. Thus Nietzsche's rejection of the witch doctor consisted of elevating Attila into a moral ideal, which meant a double surrender of morality to the witch doctor. Jeremy Bentham, the champion of capitalism, defended it by proclaiming the greatest happiness of the greatest number as its moral justification, and propounded a hedonistic calculus for men's moral guidance, which enunciated the principle that before taking any action, one must consider all the possible forms and amounts of happiness and unhappiness to accrue to all the people possibly to be affected by the consequences of one's action, including oneself as one unit among the dozens or hundreds or millions. One must compute them all, then act accordingly and sacrifice the hedonistic minority to the majority. Herbert Spencer, another champion of capitalism, chose to decide that the theory of evolution and of adaptation to environment was the key to man's morality, and declared that the moral justification of capitalism was the survival of the species, of the human race, that whoever was of no value to the race had to perish, that man's morality consisted of adapting oneself to one's social environment and seeking one's own happiness in the welfare of society, and that the automatic processes of evolution would eventually obliterate the distinction between selfishness and unselfishness. And when Karl Marx, the most consistent translator of the altruist morality into practical action and political theory, advocated a society where all would be sacrificed to all, starting with the immediate immolation of the able, the intelligent, the successful, and the wealthy. Whatever opposition he did encounter, nobody opposed him on moral grounds. Predominantly, he was granted the status of a noble but impractical idealist. The great treason of the philosophers was that they, the thinkers, defaulted on the responsibility of providing a rational society with a code of rational morality. They, whose job it was to discover and define man's moral values, stared at the brilliant torrent of man's released energy and had nothing better to offer for its guidance than the witch doctor's morality of human sacrifices, of self-denial, self-abasement, self-immolation, of suffering, guilt, and death.